The modern-day slave trade is one of the fastest-growing industries in the world. The United Nations estimates millions of men, women, and children are enslaved around the globe, generating $32 billion a year. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, human trafficking is tied with arms dealing as the second largest criminal activity in the world, second only to drug dealing. The exact number of human trafficking victims is unknown, but the United Nations International Labor Organization estimates today there are between 20 and 30 million enslaved and exploited people worldwide.
It ought to concern every person because it is a debasement of our common humanity. It ought to concern every community because it tears at our social fabric. It ought to concern every business because it distorts markets. It ought to concern every nation because it endangers public health and fuels violence and organized crime. I'm talking about the injustice, the outrage of human trafficking, which must be called by its true name, modern slavery.
Human trafficking is truly a worldwide problem. A U.S. State Department report shows documented cases of forced labor and commercial sexual exploitation in 188 countries. A United Nations report found women make up the majority of the victims, accounting for between 55 and 60% of all global cases reported between 2007 and 2010. Women and girls together account for about 75% of the victims. 27% of all victims are children. The reason behind the trafficking? The report found sexual exploitation accounts for 58% of all cases worldwide, while forced labor accounts for another 36%. But the trafficking cases, specifically for forced labor, have doubled over the past 4 years.
There's a lonely voice against slavery.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry believes America's leadership is vital in combating human trafficking around the globe.
And there are countless voiceless people, countless nameless people except to their families or perhaps a phony name by which they are being exploited, who look to us for their freedom and for the possibility of life itself. It's no understatement to say that we are working to tackle an issue that millions of people assumed had been dealt with a long time ago.
Before the adoption of the UN's Trafficking in Persons Protocol more than 10 years ago, several countries did not have any legislation addressing the problem. Today, 134 countries and territories worldwide have criminalized human trafficking. And while global legislation has changed dramatically over the last 10 years, the number of convictions for human trafficking remains very low. 16% of these countries did not record a single human trafficking conviction between 2007 and 2010. Joining me now is Dr. Mohamed Mattar, Senior Research Professor of International Law and Executive Director of the Protection Project at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. For the last 2 decades, he's worked on anti-trafficking and human rights laws in more than 75 countries. Dr. Mattar, thank you for coming on The Heat. There's been so many different definitions about trafficking, and I know you've been at this for a long time. The umbrella's kind of stretched, so give us your definition.
Yeah. Let me take you back to the year 2000. This is when we had the first definition given to us by the United Nations in the UN Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. An international consensus was built that we have a problem. This problem is called trafficking in persons or human trafficking. We mean by that basically a process whereby people are recruited for the purpose of exploitation. So if you ask me, how do you define human trafficking? The simple answer would be recruitment of people for the purpose of exploitation. The concept is very clear in my mind. What is not clear is what constitutes exploitation. Are we limiting ourselves to cases of slavery, buying and selling? Are we limiting ourselves to sexual exploitation, whether we're talking about prostitution or sex tourism or pornography, or we are expanding the concept to include all forms of human exploitation, such as forced marriage, such as domestic servitude, such as removal of human organs. So I believe that now we have a very comprehensive definition of what we consider as human trafficking. Basically, every time you are exploiting a person for any of these illicit purposes, you have a case of human trafficking.
The United Nations has identified 460 different trafficking flows. The most prominent, of course, is the East Asia one transnational flow. Why are victims from that area more likely to come? Why is that such a prominent one, would you say?
I am not sure that I agree with this premise 100%. I understand that we have a huge problem in Asia, but also we have a huge problem of human trafficking in the Middle East. We have a problem in Europe. We have a problem here in the United States. We have a problem in the America. So to start with, I want to make the case that human trafficking is a global problem. You find it everywhere. So now let's move from this global problem to Asia. Why do we have problems in Asia? The United Nations was very clear in identifying roots of the problem, the main causes of the problem. The UN talks about poverty, underdevelopment, and lack of equal opportunity. This is what you see in Asia, whether we're talking about Japan or Cambodia or Thailand or the Philippines. I would say there is poverty. I would say also that there is illegal flow of migration from one country to another within Asia. I would add to that also harmful cultural practices, cases of forced marriage, cases of domestic work. I would consider this as a problem. So if you put all that together, it can lead you to a conclusion, and that is we have a problem in Asia. And this is illustrated also by the TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report that comes out every year from the U.S. State Department. If you take a look at Tier 1, basically countries that are okay, that they're doing something, only South Korea is on Tier 1, while China is on Tier 3. Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia are on Tier 2 watch list. So the report tells you something, that government efforts are not enough. And I think, if I want to answer your question in one statement, I would say, although we have problems in Asia, such as poverty, underdevelopment, lack of equal opportunity, I think the main problem is that the governments are not doing enough. And I think this is a main problem.
Well, you brought up the Middle East, and it reports the greatest proportion of victims trafficked from other areas. What factors contribute to that, would you say?
The factors are the same all over. You were talking about developed countries, and we talk about less developed countries. We talk about widening the gap between rich and poor countries. We're talking about globalization. We're talking about people trying to seek better lives for themselves, and they end up in situations of exploitation. And that's why, to do something about the problem, you have to design a comprehensive approach. You have to think about prevention. So you don't go to countries of origin and you say, you know what, you have to raise awareness before a victim is leaving its country of origin, going to another country. She has to be aware of what she's getting into. And then you go to countries of destination and you say, make some efforts to help victims, protect the victims, provide them with assistance, perhaps shelter, perhaps residency status, and so on. So there's no easy answer to the problem.
You were talking about governments doing more, but you've also cited the United Nations. I can remember in 2001 interviewing a woman in New York in an apartment. She was bawling her eyes out, talking about her coming from Bangladesh, with someone who worked at the UN, thinking that this was a great opportunity, basically became an indentured servant for that person. And then, of course, we heard about the case in Bosnia, Catherine Bolkovac, talking about, the UN peacekeepers also involved in the trafficking. What about the policemen being the perpetrators, and how do we change that dynamic?
Yeah, excellent question. You're talking now about non-state actors, and you're talking about states being complicit in trafficking at the same time. I think what we have to do is to think about addressing all the actors who are part of the trafficking infrastructure. Peacekeeping is always a problem of jurisdiction. Who would go after those who are working under the umbrella of the UN? Countries are not doing enough to address the problem. You're having corporations who may be a problem and who are engaged in human rights abuses, including human trafficking. You have to do something about corporations.
But,
and
is the UN being serious enough about this? Are they being aggressive enough about this?
I am not sure that the problem is the UN. I think the problem is countries responding to the UN, because the UN mechanism works in a certain way, and it all relies on governments coming to the UN and engaged in the enforcement mechanism that is designed by the UN. I think the way I see the UN mechanism, I think it's working. What is not working sometimes is that countries are not paying attention to the concluding observations made by the UN.
You know this, that the U.S. State Department comes out with a human trafficking report every year, but the United States wasn't actually listed in that report until recently. Why is that? And you get back to your earlier premise, which is it's not just defined in this area or that area. The United States has a problem as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, the problem is everywhere, including here in the U.S. If you ask me why the U.S. was not involved in a report, well, it was, but not in the TIP report, in another report. So prior to 2010, the Department of Justice was the agency entrusted with the task of reporting on the status of human trafficking in this country. After the 2010, and basically because countries were asking Allah, where is the U.S. in the report, so the U.S. decided to include itself in the report starting with 2010. And it has been since on Tier 1, because the U.S. report is not about the scope of the problem. It is about government efforts to combat the problem. So you see many of the countries who are placed on Tier 1, they have huge problems, but they're doing something about it. They're trying to do something about it. There are efforts made, and that's why they are placed on Tier 1. What is the scope of the problem in this country? It is huge. You have victims coming from countries like Mexico, like Guatemala, like Honduras, like the Philippines, like Thailand, like Malaysia, coming to this country not only for the purpose of sexual exploitation, but for the purpose of forced labor as well. You have a huge problem, especially here in Washington, D.C., with domestic work, especially in the diplomatic community, recruiting people from around the world to come and work in the U.S., and then these people are being exploited, and something has to be done about it. Unfortunately, you cannot prosecute a diplomat here, and this is one of the challenges that we are facing.
Well, that can be an entire program, but we've run out of time. Dr. Mattar, thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you for having me.